Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Emsi webinars. It's great you could join us today. We're very excited. We've got a great webinar planned. I'm really happy to have Dr Riccardo De Vita from the University of Greenwich with us, and also our very own Emsi Richard Hewitt, who is Director of Higher Education. Through the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, there is a facility on your control panel box to put questions in, and we'll hopefully come to them at the end of the presentation. If we do run over a little bit, then we will get back to you personally with your answers for your questions. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Richard. Good afternoon, Richard.
Hi, Debbie, and thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to our guest, Dr. Riccardo De Vita, joining us from the University of Greenwich, from a socially distant and safe place. But Riccardo and I have known each other a while, and before working at Greenwich, or at this instance of working at Greenwich, he was working with a private provider of higher education. So he brings, let's say, multiple perspectives on this, not just the traditional university perspective to the table. So he's always an interesting person to talk to about these sorts of things. And as you are clearly aware, that this webinar is, what we're going to be talking about is how labour market data informs course design. And previously we have looked at how LMI, Labour Market Insight, can inform the programme approval process. We touched on various things there, and that's very much at that strategic level. And this is looking at an application of data that can happen really at the more tactical end of the educational journey that we go on when we're creating courses and materials and so on. Let me just see if I can move my slides on. Okay, so just a quick introduction, because we do have a number of people attending the webinar today, and I have to say it's delighted to have so many of you with us. But we have a number of people who we haven't spoken with before. So just to say, Emsi is a labour market data provider. And what we do is we connect people, education, employers through the common language of data. So basically we supply labour market data through various online tools and directly to people in all of these spaces. And really the mission is from an educational perspective to create better employment outcomes for students as they go through their educational journey, and so that's where we're coming from. And we work with universities across this country, but also across North America and Australia as well. So the way we're structuring today's webinar is, first of all, just quickly clarifying what we mean when we talk about LMI, Labour Market Insight, or Labour Market Information. Then look at some of the rationale behind using it for course design. And then Riccardo is really going to dig down into the opportunities that exist for applying that data. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about LMI? Obviously, I'm going to talk from an Emsi perspective. So for us, when Emsi talk about labour market data, labour market insight, what are we actually talking about? And I'm not going to read through this slide. This is for your reference afterwards when we send those out. But basically, there are three core data sets that make up this intelligence. On the first part is critical. That is the structural labour market data, the core LMI. This is drawn from ONS data sets for the UK, of course. So there are 8 official data sets that we draw from. and we map those together, and we're able to see industries and occupations to a highly granular level of detail, and we can see the makeup at geography to a very small geography, to local authority level, and of course we can build that up. Adjacent to that, we have our job postings analytics. This is our big data source, and we have many millions of job postings which allow us to dive deeper into what's happening in those broader economic trends, and start looking at more specific things such as skills and employers and so forth. We have a third data set as well, which gives us a snapshot of the existing labour force, and this is essentially CV data, GDPR compliant, of course, but this gives us an insight into the skills that people have, where they've studied, what they've studied, the jobs that they do, and all of this is mapped into the occupational classifications, into those SOC codes as well. So we can map all these different data sets against each other and through to each other, so they all speak as one voice. So that's the data that we're talking about when we're talking about LMI, and this is the sort of data that we supply to universities across the country. So I would say, well, this is all very, very well. Okay, yep, there's all this data, but how is this relevant to what we're talking about today? Well, labour market data is important because we need to understand where the students are going to. We need to understand the job markets that they're going to be entering if we want to be able to speak to the employability theme with any real credibility. The OFS makes it very clear that degree programs need to have clear employability outcomes, positive employability outcomes. The QAA, in its advice and guidance for course design, highlights the importance of referencing external sources. At the moment, we are seeing, for example, propositions that university funding should perhaps be linked to the importance of universities to their local economies. So there could be more of a direct link there than there is currently. That's one to keep an eye on. Certainly, with the civic engagement movement, there is already that concept that exists, anchor institutions, civic institutions, and so forth. But could that be further tied to funding? That's one to keep an eye on. So we have these external factors, and in internal factors, of course, when you are looking at program approval, you'll be thinking about the employability policy that you need to meet. You may be looking at look at demands from recruitment and marketing, who perhaps want to be maybe on a branding mission to say that you're a careers focused university or something like that, and how are your programs speaking to that? And so there can be internal demands from colleagues in the more commercial areas of the university. And then, of course, there's student demand. And I suppose in the end, that's absolutely fundamental. This is, Riccardo, I mean, it really does come down to students, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said is relevant and has been true for a while, but probably the moment we live now is even more relevant. If you say what I put there in my slide is a picture of myself. That's me. And good afternoon. Nice to meet all of you, even if virtually. And this was taken just a couple of days ago. I was running a sort of an open day, if you want, on Instagram for the University of Greenwich. And I highlighted the fact that among the questions that I received from potential applicants, the idea of looking at industry connection, the idea of looking at the value of a degree in terms of employability is becoming a regular issue, and applicants ask this regularly and often. And of course, I mean, I come from a business school, and probably business schools more than other subjects see the phenomenon of students approaching their learning in an instrumental manner. So doing so because they would like to get a good employability profile. But I think that applies to many institutions as well. And the other thing is that, again, it's about business, but probably it applies to several disciplines. I think it's our duty to find the right balance as lecturers in terms of teaching for business. So if you want to prepare graduates to be ready for employability, but also to teach about business, understand the role of business society. So I think that what you're saying, Richard, is indeed very relevant. And the way I would like to tackle this specific topic that you're talking about, so the importance of labor market information, if you can move to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So here we're basically talking about contextualization, aren't we?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think it is great that we can make our discussion with the students more localized, more relevant. I mean, one way to address this question for students is to show the immediate application, the immediate relevance of what we teach. And so I use this idea of localization to speak about this topic because it's probably a bit more used also in the academic world. And I think the idea of localizing and using this type of data to localize teaching and learning can help us in doing different things. First of all, as universities, we know that if we localize a curriculum, so we make it more relevant to specific group of students, curriculum, engagement and retention is increasing normally. And of course, this is an important metrics amongst universities, departments are measured. So is high on the list in terms of the KPIs we need to monitor. But also universities plays different roles, for example, in terms of engagement with local communities. And there are cases of studies where the idea of localizing the pedagogy in terms of teaching and learning actually helped in improving the relationship with local communities. And I think that that's even more important. So again, using labor market data to get a better understanding of what is the local context is important in that respect. And finally, and this point, if you want, can talk more to a broader agenda about widening participation, especially when we look at some group of students, for example, adult learners. We know that localizing teaching and learning and curriculum, again, is a good way to meet their needs, and adult learners react specifically to this type of approach. So if you want, the idea of localizing is important to address multiple needs that a university have.
So I suppose what we've then need to think of is then where can LMI kind of enable this contextualization? So in this journey, and we've got some ideas here, you know, and I think it's important as well to draw a difference between what we're talking about and what I've spoken about before in terms of program approval, because program approval can happen at a strategic level, at a senior or a management level, and a professional services level in a university, and we have to bear in mind that once that's happened, it's not necessarily those same people who are then authoring modules or indeed delivering them. And what we're looking at here is actually for the people who are responsible for the modules themselves, and getting the materials in front of the students, where do they have the ability to bring about this contextualization using labor market data? And so we've got some ideas here. So assessment strategies, in the module descriptors, module delivery, student guidance, personal development. But how do we put all of this together, because obviously there's no structure here, there's some ideas. So if we're keeping this student journey in mind, how do we then kind of fit this against, I suppose, a framework, Riccardo?
Well, I think that what you presented there, Richard, are very good ideas. But yeah, I think it's important to probably map these ideas along a bit of a framework. And that's my way of seeing a possible representation of when and how to use similar data. On the one hand, as you correctly said, we do have the student journey. So we have to think about how we can use similar data from the beginning. So when a student enroll into a course until the end at graduation, and going to the delivery of the different modules throughout. But another important thing that you correctly raised already is the fact that we want to empower people at different levels and closer, if you want, to the students in the classroom to use this data to take decisions. So I think we might want to look at examples of application of this data at different point in time. So something to do with course teams as a whole at the moment of design and the definition of a specific strategy. A bit later on, when the different modules are delivered, or the definition, for example, of assessment, and also thinking about in terms of support that we can provide to the students. And if you allow me, I do have 4 examples that I would like to focus on in the next few minutes around, if you want, this framework.
And just thinking about what you were just saying about the support aspect, because while that may not be necessarily something that is in curriculum, but of course lecturers in many universities are also personal tutors, aren't they? Yeah,
I mean, you have a very good point. I think there are formal roles, and in some universities, for example, where I am now, lecturers are formal personal tutors. In other institutions familiar with, there are dedicated teams. But what I mean also by support is the informal role. And I think that every lecturer at a certain point at the end of a lecture had a student approaching her or him and say, I need your advice. Can you help me with my CV? Or what do you think about my dissertation topic if I want to work in that industry? So whether maybe we don't have that label attached to our role, we de facto play this specific activity. And I think we need therefore to be mindful of the fact that we have a role of tutoring and helping students, whether this is attached to us or not.
Yeah, and of course they're coming to you in the context of you being someone who is teaching that particular module, and so that link between your knowledge of the labour market and your knowledge of the module is being linked in the student's mind, and that's why they're coming to you as an expert. So yeah, no, it's really interesting. Let's have a look at some of these examples then. So what have we got?
Okay. Thank you. So that's the first example. That's an example, if you want, at the beginning of the journey, about the design of a new course. And this is taken from a partnership experience. So a relationship between a university in the Southwest with a college in London delivering the program. And we know that normally what happens is that you do have the home institution de facto franchising a program to a partner, and the program is the same. I look at some data, and in this case, I look at a comparison by industry around the health and care industry that was the object of this specific course I'm referring to. And it's interesting to see that the 2 areas, as you can see from the slide, had very different labor market dynamics. And so while in London this specific industry was growing, it was not the case in the Southwest. And indeed, and if you want, quite surprisingly compared to what is the common experience, the specific program, even if designed and validated by the home institution, was never then delivered in the home institution because the market didn't grow as expected. Why it remained attractive and relevant in London? That was the first intuition, the fact that it can really help planning, if you want, a program and understanding, and maybe some markets are more ready than others to receive. In the next slide, I also have another point of reflection. If we look then specifically at the skills, looking at the job posting analytics instead, that normally employers associate and require for these specific roles, so for graduates from this program, there are some differences when it comes to the 2 areas. So for example, communication is extremely important in London, but it remains important, but not as the most important one, in the Southwest. And again, that was very interesting because one of the things that the teaching team felt after delivering this program for the first year is the fact that students, also because of their background, there were mainly mature students moving from an HND to a top-up year, needed a bit of extra support in terms of acquiring professional communication skills. And thanks also to this data, a proper discussion, if you want, between the two institutions started about reviewing the portfolio of modules and introducing a new specific option that was, on the one hand, ticking the employability box, but also, and most importantly somehow, be sure that students were also receiving something that was valuable for the learning experience. So that was my first example. I do have probably, oh yes, that was an animation that came in a bit late.
Sorry.
That's okay. So continuing, if you want, in this student journey perspective, once we design a course, the next thing we want to do is defining a strategy. It has to do with teaching, learning, and assessment. And in this example specifically, I'm talking about an assessment. And here I consider a potential scenario. I work at the University of Greenwich, and often we speak about the London job market. So what I did, I searched for information about the role HR managers. We have a degree at the University of Greenwich in my department about human resource management. And I compared the skills, if you look at London as a whole, against instead the Greenwich and some local authorities that are close by. And I do this because often we know that we do have a community of students that is very much local. Greenwich take part of its pride in the fact that it serves local community. And there are some variations. The skills that you see listed here in green are the ones that are appearing as more important in Greenwich and neighboring areas when compared to London as a whole. And when instead the one highlighted in red are the ones that appear important in London, but less important somehow in Greenwich. And I try to summarize in the next slide a bit of a message coming from this table. And the fact is that the same occupation, of course, has some commonalities, but there are nuances, there are different skills. So in London, there is a strong emphasis on some cross-disciplinary element, for example, software development, relational skills such as stakeholder management. In Greenwich, it seems more rooted into businessy activities, KPIs, budgeting, procurement. So if we are delivering the same module, let's say, but thinking about these two markets, well, one thing that we might want to consider in designing an assignment, for example, is to have different case studies. One looking more about governance and risks, while another one looking more at healthcare sector, because nursing was a key skill emerging in Greenwich. Or because of the prevalence in Greenwich of skills related to KPIs, budgeting, maybe gearing the assignment more toward quantitative bits, without making the course as a quantitative component, but introducing more numbers. And thinking about different type of assessments, so maybe replacing a presentation with a quantitative test. So these are all ideas I believe that a team could find very, very useful. In the next example, instead, I speak, if you want, again, at a more granular level, and I talk about the delivery of a specific module. So what I did here, instead, is looking at the potential situation of a provider in multiple campuses in London, which we know is often the case, especially in the private sector world, but it applies to other institutions where you do have a university with multiple campuses. And even in one city, you can have very, very different situations. So for example, when we look at the occupation overview in the human resource world, and you compare three different areas in London, we can see different type of information, not just different market dynamics, as I used in my first example, but for example, we can look which are the main employers, so the main recruiters for, in this case, HR managers. And in London, you do have monetary intermediation. In Brent, you do have hospitals. If you go toward east instead, so toward more Redbridge, you do have PA, public order. And while the job title advertised are consistently similar at some point, so for example, business process consultant appeared as the most important one across the board, when you go a bit more in the details, you can see there are variations. So for example, Redbridge, where there is a lot of colleges, for example, the word of education consultant, director of recruitment appears regularly. In Brent, HR managers, business advisor, while in London is an HR consultant or recruiter. So again, that suggests that we might want to do something different. And the example of what we can do differently is in my next slide. So again, still looking at the main employers in the areas, what came up is that, for example, in Brent, IKEA and Delaware North, that is associated with the management of the Wembley Stadium, are the top poster in terms of job posting and therefore recruiter in the area, while in Redbridge, public services. So one thinking is about choice of case study, for example. So delivering specific case study to different locations in London, or apply the same HR theories, but in different industries. So for example, thinking about the application of leadership in a public service compared to a private company, because obviously there are different adaptation. And again, if you look at the skills, so if instead we look at the table on the right side of the slide, we can see that there are some variations. So for example, in the city, Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud came as a very important skill to have, while that's not necessarily the case in other areas. And again, this similarly, if you want, to the previous example, gives an idea of the fact that we might want to tweak a bit of the delivery of different modules so that to tick all these boxes and be explicit with the students so that they can go to a job interview that can actually mention these keywords to be more employable. And I do have a final example before some conclusions. And this goes back to what you asked and what you remarked, Richard, in terms of tutoring. I do have a bit of a framework around that, and that's a framework that I really, really like about support of students. In my next slide, I present what some scholars develop about the education journey. And this is summarized as a sequence of transition into university, transition through university, and out of university. And I go back to what you said, Richard. Sometimes we are not formally a personal tutor, but de facto we help students. We are with them along this journey. We meet them at an open day. We meet them at an induction when they transition to university. We teach them, and therefore we speak to them while they experience the learning. And often we give them advice when they're about to transition out of university, or we write them a reference to help them applying for specific jobs. So we are with them along this journey. So what can we do? How can we use some of the tools that are out there to help this process? And I have a few examples along this journey in my next slide. So starting at the beginning, transitioning to university, what I found very useful is to use information about the labor market, about the value of acquiring a degree. So for example, in my previous job, I was often talking to students moving from an HND to a top-up. And one of the key questions was, what's the added value? Why do I need to study an additional year to get a level 6 qualification? Well, if we can go at the level of the data that allow us to say that by getting a level 6 qualification, you are more likely to tap into some job market, as an example is there on the slide, well, then of course this is a very strong argument and to initiate a discussion with the students. But we can help students in the journey to transition through university in different ways. What I have in my slide under the box transitioning through university is a list of learning outcomes. These are real learning outcomes taken from modules at different levels about different topics. And you can see how clearly we as lecturers, because this is a module handbook, we have to demonstrate that students achieve some learning outcomes that has to do with job market. So why not using this data to help students, for example, shaping their CV, searching for information? And there are some great tools out there when students, maybe the first time they write a CV, can find prompts, can understand what are the skills that are more often associated with specific jobs, so they can have an idea on how to structure and present their own CV. And finally, we can do more in terms of transitioning out of university, because we can look through some of the databases we have access to, for example, about the next step. So the last little list of jobs that I have on my slide is the result of a search I did by looking at what are the most common job titles associated with a CIPD level 7 qualification in HR. And that again is a very interesting thing. So you have students finishing their study, planning their continuous professional development. You can tell, look, if you want to study more, or if you think about in a few years down the line to get another qualification, these are the kind of position you might want to target in the future. So these were my examples. If I can take 1 minute more just to go through some final remarks that I have in my next slide. I mean, I try to come and speak from an academic perspective here. And what I'd like to mention is that the examples that I try to build in these slides are all examples that are not high intensity, if you want, because I know that sometimes it can be challenging to promote a module change or a course change because of the required QA regulation, because of the time frame. But some of these things can be done locally, can be done quickly in a short period of time. And in this way, I believe everybody can play a role and see immediate results from their action. The other thing, in my experience,
I was just going to jump in, Riccardo, and say it's a bit like if you're teaching a module, even you're not the module leader, it's deciding which case study you're going to use. This is something that you can make a data-informed decision on. It's not something that necessarily has to go through a big approval process, or you have to get the thumbs up from the module leader or anything like that. That's something an individual lecturer can decision that they can make that will have a positive impact on employability.
Oh, and that's an absolutely relevant example, Richard. Thank you. I mean, reality, for example, what we do with our international partners, we often have this discussion. We ask them to consider localized case studies. Well, here we might have even data to actually suggest which are the best case studies, not just a feeling that people have, but it can be data-driven, which I believe is the way forward. And in general, I mean, building on this idea, the fact that such data can empower teams to engage with both internal and external stakeholders, because of course, if team of module leaders or course leaders see data and understand that there is a potential market for a program, it's a much easier conversation to have with the senior managers in the university. If they want to promote a change and they can say, look, this is going to be improving the employability statistics of the department, I'm sure the other department will be more willing to listen to such an argument. And the same.
Sorry, I just jump in again, and certainly in my role, I speak to a lot of market insight teams at universities, and you know, often what they tell me is that they get these requests from academics across the institution, and they're always turning around saying, well, what's the evidence that there's an employment market for this? And it's very much reactive, whereas this is using data in this way, as you say, it empowers the academics to actually be proactive and say, look, here's the data, here's hard evidence that there is a market.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you, and I think I've been on both sides of the argument. I started as a lecturer several years ago when I started working here in the UK, and now I'm at the department. So I've been having this conversation on both sides, and now I appreciate the importance of a very good business case to put forward an idea for change, and such data give you that power to do so. But also when talking to students, I mean, it's not just having discussion with internal stakeholders, but also with students, because the moment we talk to them and we say, look, this module, this program help you in achieving what you want, it speaks to their needs and also probably shift the conversation, because it get their attention. And at that point, we can move away from that pure instrumentality, if you want, to learning that sometimes we fear, but actually get the students more engaged, more emotionally committed to what we do and what we're also passionate about. So that's the thing. And the last couple of points that I have there are somehow related, but I think I see another important issue here. These are data, and we know that data are important for several profiles, for several jobs, not just in business, in many other disciplines. Why don't we use this data to help students thinking? I mean, for example, I gave an example earlier that in some modules, we are expecting to provide students an opportunity to learn about specific job market trends. Why don't we give them some data and we ask them to engage, to critically analyze them, to reflect them, to produce statistics, statistical analysis on such data, so that I think we can reduce the fear of data, because the student will be more passionate and more engaged into dealing and learning something that is closer to what they want to do, rather than maybe doing an example on some abstract or far away cases that are not relevant for them. And that can be done at the level of single modules or even of a dissertation. So we can use this data to actually shape a bit larger project where the student can go and independently learn something on a topic that is core to their passion and interest. So these are, if you want, my final considerations.
Yeah, but that's a really, really interesting point. So while we've been talking about the application of data, actually the data itself as a raw material to provide the students is an interesting resource. And I know when we were promoting that we're running this webinar, one of the people who engaged with that mentioned that you know, actually being able to understand and interpret data is a key skill that students are said to be lacking, and that may be anecdotal. I'm sure there probably is evidence for that somewhere, but actually giving this data to students, and it doesn't matter what program they're studying, because they will all be entering a job market, and you know, is useful. And certainly, I suppose, if I'm playing devil's advocate though to this, of course, and you might say, well, hang on, you've been talking about contextualizing data to local economies, but you know, let's say we take students from all around the country and or internationally, and our students go into a whole range of different job markets. So how relevant is it for this context?
Well, I mean, I think is a very good question. The way, I'm sure that a lot of other colleagues will have their own take on this, but what I would do just as an immediate reaction to this idea is, well, even better, because then I can split my tutorial of 30 students into a group of 3 or 4 based on different parts of London they come from or different countries they come from, ask them to look at the same profession in different areas, see commonalities and difference, because in this way you not only create data awareness, data familiarity, but also you promote a bit of more of a critical discussion and comparison, which is equally an important skill for the job market. So that's not a challenge, but actually an opportunity to build on. And again, you give real data to move away from stereotyping if you want, and give opportunity to discuss around evidence of differences across regions.
And I suppose it's not unreasonable for a university to use as you know, a teaching base that data from its local area. I mean, that's, or its region. That's not an unreasonable thing to be doing. It'd be odd if a university, I don't know, in the northeast were always using London data. That would be odd. So as it would for a London university always to be using data, I don't know, from Scotland. But so having a local context to answer the question I was asking is not something that takes away from what you're doing. I think it enriches it. But you're right, Riccardo, there are opportunities as well to bring in data from other areas, and that goes to I suppose the importance of understanding your students, understanding where they're coming from in terms of which parts of the country or countries that they are coming from, but also understanding their destinations and where they go to. You know, the surveys I've seen, which I believe are from Youth Site, show that the biggest grouping of students that are recruited are from the university's local region, but also the biggest grouping of students that exist in terms of employment are those which are then employed in the same region. And I mean, you mentioned widening participation briefly earlier, Riccardo, and of course we also know that widening participation students are also more likely to stay in their local area. So there are lots of good reasons to be grounded in your local data, but you don't have to be restricted by it either.
Oh, absolutely, I agree with you. So I think, yeah, the data is there. I think the way that we use it is really down to a lot of creativity and what different teams, different individuals can do with it.
So then the question is getting that data out there, not just having the data in the hands of the course planners and the professional market insights teams or the marketing teams, but getting it into the hands of the academics. And the data is all there, it's easy to use. It's just making sure that the silos are broken down a bit and people are talking to each other and you know, in the way that's suitable for the context of your university, whether you've got employability teams who intersect with the academics who handle this, or whether it's the careers advice and guidance. But all of this, I think what you've shown today, Riccardo, is really that the lecturers themselves have the ability to make a real direct impact on these employability outcomes without having to worry about going to various committees and revalidation processes to get these things approved. These can happen whenever the delivery team want them to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just some further thoughts just to share with people in terms of the data and how it's we see it being applied throughout the sector. as I said, universities across the country are using it, but what we do see is they use it for different things initially, and then it tends to spread through different teams as the silos get broken down within those universities. And it's quite interesting to see, from my perspective, actually, where the data is being used. So today we talked about the employability aspect, and so before we talked about portfolio planning, today we've talked about course design, but we also see it in direct employer engagement applications, so through placements, degree apprenticeships, alumni employment, those aspects. We see it in student recruitment as well as careers guidance, and Riccardo touched on it with his mentioning of the Instagram event, but certainly what I hear from heads of student recruitment that I speak to is one of the most common questions they get asked or have previously been asked when open days were allowed is, what are the what job can I do if I study this course? And so helping, the data is being used to align those careers to courses, and we do a lot of that mapping work for institutions. Look, alumni outcomes of course as well. I mentioned before that the profiles data we have, and we can see what people studied, where they studied, and so we can start to look at first job, second job, third job, and start to collate that data, and actually, it's quite rich. So we might have, I don't know, 50,000 profiles from your university, and we can actually see their career progression, and we might see their first job when they recorded their Delhi return or their GOS return is something in food production or something like that, but by the time they get to their third position, it's really quite interesting to see where they've gone to. We've done some work with universities in Australia where we've looked at whether people actually stayed in the profession for which they studied, and we've looked at what skills kept them in that profession. But then we've looked at their peers who may have moved out into other professions, so not in the area for which they studied, and we've looked at the skills they took with them and look at which skills made them highly transferable. And so that's been a really interesting application of the data. In terms of research and REF and KEF, so with the proposal for KEF looking at local growth and regeneration, knowing that local economic data is important for that. And same if you're looking at research impact and local impact for a REF submission, being able to give the context in which that research application is having its impact. So again, being able to describe that local economy and the importance of an industry or a particular occupation within an industry or set of industries to that local area. Again, it's about being able to measure things. And of course, I mentioned right at the beginning, civic engagement, and really understanding that local economy and how a university engages with its local economy. We've done a report about this, and do drop me an email if you're interested in how data is being used for civic engagement, as we've got a free report that I'm more than happy to share on that. So those were some, just share some thoughts on other areas that labour market data is being used by institutions, and how it kind of disseminates out from the initial team that starts using it. So that's all from my side. Then to just pop across to Debbie and ask, are there any questions that people might have for myself or particularly Riccardo?
We have a question about how easy is it for academics to access the data? Yeah,
so if a university has a license for Emsi data, then whoever within the institution holds that license, they have the ability to enable colleagues to have a license. There will be in the contract a number of licenses that they will have. Typically it's 10, so if there's a license available, they can use it, and if there isn't, then we can talk about additional licenses. But it's once you have access, it's very, very easy to get hold of the data. If anyone's interested to see how it works, very happy to to demonstrate that. And if your institution does already have Emsi data, then it's talking to the team that has it, and I'm happy to help with that internal comms if you're not sure, and talking to them about getting it. Of course, if you have it but there isn't a license available, of course you just have to ask your colleague very, very nicely for the data, but it's very easy to access. So if you know what data you're after, it's very easy to get the data out. I'm talking a couple of minutes. I'm not talking an hour or a couple of hours or something like that. It really is in terms of minutes, and they can send you a PDF or a Word document or whatever format you'd want to see it. So it's once you've got it, it's very easy to access.
Great, thanks. The other thing I've got here as a question is it too early to forecast the impact of COVID-19 on universities, especially on the apprenticeship recruitment?
I'm not sure about apprenticeship recruitment, so I'm not sure I've got a ready-made answer for that, and certainly the impact on universities. All of us are aware of this and are feeling it. From a labour market data perspective, it depends. I suppose the general answer is it really depends how quickly we're able to get the economy up and running. So there haven't been structural problems with the economy, and so if we're able to return to normality to some extent, then the more likely it is that there will be some kind of bounce. Of course, the longer things continue, then it's possible you start to build in structural problems into the economy, particularly with unemployment. And so that will then cause problems. And of course, we're really in a very fluid situation at the moment, with announcements being made today. So I think it's a watch this space at the moment. There are a lot of hypotheses about what may happen, but I think it's a bit too soon to tell. In terms of the data that we've got, the core economic data, we won't really see much new data coming through until the end of the year from the ONS that will give us a clear sense of the impact that's happening. The data we've got at the moment that we're seeing come through it includes all of Q1, so it's, you know, we're not really seeing the results of, you know, the impact of March, because it's averaged against January and February as well, so it's not particularly helpful. Where we can start to see some impacts is in the job postings data on our website. If you go to emsidata.co.uk, you will see a link on the homepage to be able to see our dashboard on where we're seeing impacts. If you want to see one for your local enterprise partnership region, your LEP region, just ping me an email and I can send you one of those. We're refreshing those every week at the moment. So the next bit of data that we'll see that will give us a bit of indication that will come through in the next couple of weeks or so is the unemployment data. So who's employing unemployment benefits, and we will be blogging about that. So keep an eye on our blog, because that should give us some indications as which industries which occupations are being hit, and from that we can then see through to which industries are being hit as well.
That's great. Thanks, Richard. No more other questions.
That's great. So Riccardo, thank you ever so much for your time. Massively appreciated. And I hope you eat well and things continue to go well for Greenwich.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thanks to the audience.
Right. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.